The words cut through the morning air like shattered glass, piercing the thin walls of Margaret Martinez's cramped apartment with surgical precision. "We had the best engagement dinner yesterday. Who wants an old disable like you at the luxury party?" Victoria's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who had forgotten what love looked like, her laughter mixing with the giggling responses of her friends in the hallway outside. Margaret felt the blood drain from her weathered face as she gripped the edge of her worn armchair, her arthritic fingers trembling against the faded fabric that had witnessed 30 years of hopes and heartbreak. The delicate porcelain teacup she had been holding, a remnant from her wedding china, one of the few precious things she had left, slipped from her grasp and crashed to the linoleum floor. The sound of shattering ceramic echoed through her small living room like the breaking of her own heart, fragments scattering across the floor in a pattern that seemed to mirror the pieces of her shattered relationship with her only child. Margaret's chest tightened, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the cruel reality of her daughter's words sank in. The woman she had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless fevers, walked to school every morning for 12 years, worked 3 jobs to put through college. That same woman had just dismissed her as nothing more than an embarrassing disability, an inconvenience to be hidden away from polite society. The walls of her tiny apartment seemed to close in around her as she struggled to process the magnitude of Victoria's betrayal. This wasn't just neglect or busy schedules or the natural drift that sometimes occurred between adult children and their parents. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty delivered with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. Margaret's mind raced back through the months and years, searching for signs she had missed, moments when she should have seen this coming. But even now, even with Victoria's words still ringing in her ears, part of her couldn't believe her daughter, her baby, was capable of such heartless dismissal. 32 years ago, Margaret had been a vibrant woman with dreams as big as the Texas sky. She had met James Martinez at a church dance when she was barely 19, falling in love with his gentle smile and the way he treated her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They married 6 months later in a ceremony that cost more than they could afford but filled their hearts with hope for the future. James had worked construction, his hands rough but tender when he held her face and promised her a lifetime of love and children and the little house with the white picket fence that every young couple dreamed of. Margaret worked as a secretary at a small law firm, saving every penny they could spare for the family they planned to build together. When Victoria was born, Margaret thought her heart might burst from the pure joy of holding her daughter for the first time. The baby was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and the most beautiful dark eyes that seemed to look right into Margaret's soul. James cried when he first held his daughter, whispering promises about being the best father in the world, about giving her everything she could ever want or need. For 2 blissful years, they lived the American dream in miniature. James would come home covered in dust and concrete, but his face would light up the moment Victoria toddled toward him on unsteady legs, her chubby arms reaching up for Daddy's hugs. Margaret would watch them together and feel like the luckiest woman alive, convinced that nothing could touch their perfect little family. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Margaret had been folding Victoria's tiny clothes, humming softly while her 2-year-old daughter played with blocks on the living room floor. The voice on the other end was clinical, professional, devastating. There had been an accident at the construction site. A beam had fallen. James was gone. The world had collapsed around Margaret with the same sudden violence as that teacup hitting the floor this morning. At 23, she found herself a widow with a toddler to raise and no clear path forward. The life insurance barely covered the funeral costs. The savings they had accumulated vanished within months. The little house with a picket fence was sold to pay off debts James's death had created. Margaret had made a vow at James's graveside, holding Victoria's small hand as dirt was thrown onto the casket that contained her dreams. She would give her daughter everything she had planned to give her together with James. Victoria would go to the best schools, have the finest opportunities, never want for anything that love and determination could provide. The years that followed were a blur of exhaustion and sacrifice that Margaret wore like badges of honor. She worked the morning shift at Henderson's Diner, serving coffee and eggs to truckers and early commuters. In the afternoons, she cleaned offices downtown, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while Victoria stayed with Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who became like a grandmother to the little girl. 3 nights a week, Margaret worked a third job, stocking shelves at the all-night grocery store. She would come home at dawn, catch 2 hours of sleep, then get Victoria ready for school before starting the cycle all over again. Her hands grew rough from cleaning chemicals, her back ached from constant bending and lifting, but every sacrifice felt worthwhile when she saw Victoria's report cards filled with A's or watched her daughter's face light up on Christmas morning. Margaret never bought herself new clothes, making do with thrift store finds and hand-me-downs from the church ladies. She drove the same battered Ford for 15 years, nursing it along with prayer and determination because every dollar saved meant another dollar toward Victoria's college fund. She learned to cut hair from YouTube videos rather than pay for salon visits, and she grew a small vegetable garden behind their apartment building to stretch the grocery budget. But Victoria never knew about the sacrifices. Margaret made sure of that. Her daughter always had new school clothes each fall, nice birthday parties with store-bought cakes, and every book or school supply she needed. When Victoria expressed interest in piano lessons, Margaret found a way to pay for them, even though it meant eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 3 months. The first signs of Margaret's disability appeared when Victoria was in high school. It started as occasional stiffness in her joints, moments when her hands wouldn't quite obey her commands. Margaret attributed it to years of physical labor, the inevitable wear and tear of working multiple jobs and carrying the weight of single parenthood. She hid it as long as she could. When her fingers grew too stiff to tie Victoria's elaborate hairstyles for school dances, Margaret claimed she was too busy. When climbing stairs became painful, she made excuses to stay on the ground floor. When the trembling in her hands made it difficult to write checks, she switched to online banking and told Victoria it was more convenient. The diagnosis came during Victoria's senior year: rheumatoid arthritis, progressive and degenerative. The doctor explained it in terms that sounded like a death sentence for Margaret's independence. Joint damage, mobility issues, increasing pain and disability over time. There were treatments that could slow the progression, but they were expensive, and Margaret's health insurance through the diner had high deductibles and limited coverage. Margaret made the decision that would define the rest of their relationship. She chose Victoria's future over her own health. Instead of spending money on the experimental treatments the doctor recommended, she put every penny toward Victoria's college tuition at the prestigious university that had accepted her with a partial scholarship. The remaining costs were still overwhelming, but Margaret took out loans, worked overtime whenever possible, and even sold her wedding rings to help cover the expenses. Victoria graduated summa cum laude with a degree in marketing and business. Margaret watched from the audience, her hands now noticeably shaky but her heart swelling with pride as her daughter walked across that stage. Every sleepless night, every aching muscle, every sacrifice had led to this moment. Victoria was educated, poised, ready to take on the world, everything Margaret had dreamed she could become. The job offers came quickly. Victoria chose a position at Prestige Marketing, one of the city's most exclusive firms, with a starting salary that was more than Margaret had ever made in a single year. She moved into a stylish apartment downtown, bought fashionable clothes, and began building the successful life Margaret had worked so hard to make possible. But success changed Victoria in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. The phone calls became less frequent. Visits grew shorter and more rushed. Victoria began making excuses about why she couldn't come to family gatherings or why she had to leave early when she did stop by. Margaret noticed but tried not to judge. She told herself that Victoria was simply busy building her career, that the demands of professional life were different from anything Margaret had experienced. She made allowances, swallowed disappointment, and continued to be proud of her daughter's achievements. The changes were gradual at first. Victoria stopped bringing friends around to meet Margaret, claiming she was too busy for social visits. She began criticizing Margaret's appearance, suggesting she needed better clothes, that her apartment was too small and shabby, that her cooking wasn't sophisticated enough for Victoria's refined palate. "You should really do something about your hair, Mother," Victoria would say, eyeing Margaret's simple gray bob with distaste. "And maybe we should look into getting you some nicer clothes. You can't keep dressing like..." Well, like you do. Margaret tried to accommodate these criticisms, spending money she didn't have on a haircut at an expensive salon and buying a dress from a department store instead of her usual thrift shops. But Victoria's response was lukewarm at best, and Margaret sensed that no amount of external changes would address whatever was really bothering her daughter. The truth became clear when Victoria landed a major promotion and began moving in higher social circles. She started dating Richard Ashworth, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Suddenly, Victoria's embarrassment about her humble origins became impossible to hide. Margaret first noticed it when Victoria stopped inviting her to company functions. Previously, Victoria had been proud to introduce her hard-working mother to colleagues, but now those invitations ceased entirely. When Margaret asked about it, Victoria claimed the events were boring business affairs that would be tedious for someone without professional experience. Then Victoria began making excuses to avoid visiting Margaret's apartment. It was too far from her office. The neighborhood wasn't safe. She was working late most nights and weekends. Each excuse stung more than the last, but Margaret told herself that Victoria was simply focused on her career advancement. The photo albums were the first casualties of Victoria's reinvention. Margaret had lovingly maintained scrapbooks documenting every milestone of Victoria's childhood. First steps, birthday parties, school plays, graduation ceremonies. These albums sat prominently on Margaret's coffee table, ready to share memories with anyone who visited. One day, Margaret noticed Victoria looking at the albums with something that looked like shame. "Do you have to keep these out, Mother? Or so dated. And some of these pictures." Victoria's voice trailed off, but Margaret understood. The pictures showed their modest apartment, Margaret's worn furniture, the homemade birthday cakes and second-hand clothes that had been all they could afford but which now seemed embarrassing to Victoria's sophisticated eyes. Margaret quietly moved the albums to her bedroom, telling herself it was just to reduce clutter in the small living room. But she understood the real message. Victoria's past, and by extension Margaret herself, had become something to be hidden rather than celebrated. The final transformation occurred after Victoria's relationship with Richard became serious. Suddenly, her daughter was frequenting country clubs and charity galas, appearing in the society pages of the local newspaper, and moving in circles where pedigree and appearance mattered more than character or heart. Margaret watched from the sidelines as Victoria became someone she barely recognized. Gone was the warm, compassionate young woman who had once volunteered at homeless shelters and tutored struggling children. In her place was someone cold and calculating, someone who measured relationships by their potential for social advancement. The distance between them grew from emotional to physical when Victoria moved to the penthouse apartment 2 floors above Margaret's modest unit in the same building. Margaret had been thrilled when Victoria suggested they live in the same building. She thought it meant her daughter wanted to be close to her. Instead, it became a daily reminder of how far apart they had grown. Victoria would rush past Margaret in the lobby without stopping to chat. She installed private elevator access to avoid sharing the regular elevator with other residents, including her mother. When they did encounter each other, Victoria's conversations were brief and strained, filled with barely concealed impatience to escape. The cruel comments began as small slights. Victoria would criticize Margaret's appearance when they met in the hallway. "Mother, you really should do something about that walker. It's so institutional." Or she would make cutting remarks about Margaret's social life. "Still playing bingo with the church ladies? How quaint." Each comment felt like a small knife wound, but Margaret convinced herself that Victoria was just stressed from work, that the cutting remarks came from exhaustion rather than malice. She continued to believe that underneath the harsh exterior, her loving daughter still existed. The truth shattered that illusion this morning. Standing outside Margaret's door with her friends from the marketing firm, Victoria had spoken about her own mother with the same casual dismissal she might use to discuss an unwanted piece of furniture or an outdated appliance. Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race as the full impact of Victoria's words sank in. She wasn't just being neglected or taken for granted. She was being actively rejected, dismissed as an embarrassment too shameful to acknowledge. The woman who had given up everything to ensure Victoria's success, who had worked herself into disability to provide opportunities her daughter now took for granted, had been reduced to nothing more than an old disable who had no place at luxury parties. Margaret looked around her small apartment, seeing it now through Victoria's eyes. The furniture was indeed worn and outdated. Her clothes were simple and practical rather than fashionable. Her hands shook from arthritis, and she needed a walker to get around safely. By the standards of Victoria's new world, Margaret was indeed an embarrassment, a reminder of poverty and struggle that had no place among the beautiful people. But this apartment told the story of love and sacrifice. Every worn piece of furniture represented a choice to spend money on Victoria's needs instead of new decorations. Every simple meal Margaret ate represented a fancy dinner or school trip she had funded for her daughter. Every sleepless night spent working multiple jobs was an investment in Victoria's future that was now being repaid with shame and rejection. As Margaret sat among the scattered pieces of her broken teacup, she realized that her relationship with Victoria had been shattered just as completely. The daughter she had raised was gone, replaced by someone who valued appearances over authenticity, wealth over love, social status over family bonds. The sound of Victoria's laughter echoed through the thin walls as she continued her conversation with friends, the casual cruelty of her words still hanging in the air like poison. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to remember the little girl who had once promised to take care of her mama forever, who had drawn pictures of them living together in a big house where Margaret would never have to work again. That little girl was gone, and in her place was someone Margaret barely recognized, someone capable of treating her own mother's love and sacrifice as nothing more than an inconvenience to be hidden away. The morning sun streamed through Margaret's small window, illuminating the broken pieces of china scattered across the floor. Each fragment caught the light differently, creating tiny rainbows that reminded Margaret of the dreams she had once held for her daughter. Those dreams lay shattered now, broken as completely as the teacup, and Margaret wasn't sure they could ever be put back together again. But even as her heart broke, even as she faced the devastating reality of her daughter's rejection, Margaret found herself whispering a prayer for Victoria. Not for reconciliation or apology, but for the return of the compassionate heart that had once beat inside the little girl Margaret had loved with every fiber of her being. The prayer ended as Victoria's voice faded down the hallway, leaving Margaret alone with her tears and the remnants of a love that had been 30 years in the making and 30 seconds in the breaking. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across Margaret's small apartment, she found herself surrounded by the ghosts of better times. Photo albums spread across her dining table like evidence in a case she couldn't quite bear to prosecute. Her arthritic fingers traced the edges of photographs that told the story of a mother's unwavering devotion and a daughter's gradual transformation from grateful child to cruel stranger. Here was 3-year-old Victoria on her first day of preschool, clutching Margaret's hand with fierce determination while wearing the yellow dress Margaret had sewn herself, staying up until 2 in the morning to finish the tiny buttons and perfect the hem. Margaret remembered how Victoria had refused to let go of her hand that first morning, how she had whispered, "Don't leave me, Mama," with the absolute trust that only small children possess. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret now. How desperately Victoria had once needed her presence, and how desperately she now seemed to want Margaret to disappear entirely from her life. Margaret turned the page and found Victoria at age 7, gap-toothed and grinning beside the birthday cake Margaret had made from scratch because store-bought cakes were beyond their budget. The kitchen had been sweltering that August afternoon, but Margaret had insisted on making Victoria's favorite chocolate cake with pink frosting roses, even though it meant working with her hands cramped from arthritis that was already beginning to manifest in subtle ways. Victoria had declared it the most beautiful cake in the world, insisting that her friends from school take pictures with it before they could eat a single bite. "My mama made this just for me," she had announced with the pride of a child who understood instinctively that love could be measured in homemade frosting roses and careful attention to details that mattered to 7-year-old hearts. Margaret's pension check for the month was $847.32, barely enough to cover rent on her modest apartment, utilities, and the most basic groceries. She had learned to stretch every dollar with the creativity of someone who had been poor for so long that poverty had become a kind of art form. She bought generic brands, clipped coupons with religious dedication, and had mastered the art of making soup from bones and vegetables that other people might throw away. The apartment itself was a testament to decades of making do with less. The furniture was mismatched pieces acquired over the years from garage sales, thrift stores, and the occasional generous neighbor who was replacing something that still had life left in it. Margaret had learned to reupholster chairs with fabric samples from the discount store, to paint tables multiple times to hide scratches and water stains, to make curtains from bedsheets when she couldn't afford proper window treatments. But every item in the apartment held memories of the life she had built for Victoria. The coffee table with a burn mark from when 8-year-old Victoria had left a hot mug on the surface was the same table where Victoria had done her homework every evening, Margaret sitting beside her to help with math problems and spelling words. The bookshelf with the slightly warped shelves held the fairy tale collections Margaret had read aloud night after night, doing different voices for each character until Victoria fell asleep with a smile on her face. Margaret walked slowly to the kitchen, her walker making soft sounds against the linoleum floor that had been installed when Victoria was in high school. She had saved for 2 years to afford even this modest improvement, working extra shifts at the diner and taking on additional cleaning jobs until she had enough money to replace the cracked and stained flooring that had embarrassed Victoria when her friends came over. The kitchen window looked out onto the small courtyard where Victoria had learned to ride her first bicycle, Margaret running alongside her while holding the back of the seat, both of them laughing when Victoria finally found her balance and pedaled independently for the first time. Margaret could still remember the pure joy on Victoria's face when she realized she was riding all by herself, the way she had immediately turned to look for Margaret's proud smile. Those memories felt like they belonged to different people now, to a mother and daughter who had existed in some alternate universe where love and gratitude were stronger than shame and social ambition. Victoria's transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, like watching a beautiful garden slowly overtaken by weeds, so subtle at first that Margaret had convinced herself she was imagining the changes. The shift had begun during Victoria's junior year of college, when she started dating boys from wealthy families and spending weekends at their parents' country homes. Margaret remembered the phone call when Victoria had described a weekend at someone's estate in the mountains, her voice filled with wonder at the luxury she had experienced. "Mom, you should see this place. They have a kitchen bigger than our entire apartment, and servants who bring you coffee in bed, and a swimming pool that looks like it belongs at a resort." At the time, Margaret had been happy to hear Victoria experiencing such luxury, thinking it was good for her daughter to see how successful people lived, to have goals and ambitions for her own future. She hadn't realized that these experiences were also teaching Victoria to be ashamed of her own humble background, to see Margaret's modest lifestyle as something to escape rather than appreciate. The changes became more pronounced after Victoria graduated and started working at Prestige Marketing. Suddenly, everything about Margaret's life seemed to embarrass her daughter. The way Margaret dressed became too dowdy for someone whose daughter worked at such a prestigious firm. The way Margaret spoke became too unsophisticated for the social circles Victoria was trying to penetrate. The apartment that had been perfectly adequate for 25 years suddenly became too small and shabby for someone of Victoria's rising status. Margaret had tried to adapt, spending money she couldn't afford on clothes Victoria approved of, practicing more formal speech patterns, even taking a community college course on etiquette in hopes of being more acceptable to her daughter's evolving standards. But nothing she did seemed good enough. Every effort to improve herself was met with lukewarm approval at best, and often with additional criticism that made Margaret feel like she was failing a test whose rules kept changing. The financial disparity between them had become a source of constant tension. Victoria earned more in a month than Margaret received in pension benefits for an entire year, yet Victoria seemed to resent any reminder of Margaret's financial struggles. When Margaret mentioned needing to budget carefully for groceries, Victoria would respond with impatience. "Godmother, you're so obsessed with money. Can't you just buy what you need and worry about it later?" What Victoria didn't understand, or perhaps chose not to understand, was that Margaret's careful budgeting was the only thing standing between her and complete financial disaster. There was no worrying about it later, when you lived on a fixed income that barely covered basic expenses. Every purchase had to be planned, every expense had to be justified, every dollar had to be stretched as far as possible. Margaret's medical expenses had become increasingly burdensome as her arthritis progressed. The medications that helped manage her pain cost more than her grocery budget for a month, even with Medicare coverage. Physical therapy sessions that might help preserve her mobility were considered optional by her insurance company, meaning she paid out of pocket or went without. The special equipment that could make daily tasks easier, ergonomic kitchen tools, supportive cushions, better lighting, were luxuries she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, Victoria spent money with the casual indifference of someone who had never known true want. She bought designer handbags that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, dined at restaurants where a single meal could feed Margaret for a week, and redecorated her apartment with furniture and accessories that represented months of Margaret's income. The contrast was painful, but what hurt Margaret most wasn't the inequality itself. It was Victoria's apparent inability to remember the sacrifices that had made her success possible. Victoria acted as if her achievements had materialized out of thin air, as if her education and opportunities had been her birthright rather than the result of Margaret's decades of back-breaking labor and self-denial. Margaret often found herself staring at the ceiling late at night, listening to the sounds of Victoria's life filtering down from the penthouse above. There were frequent dinner parties with laughter and conversation that lasted well into the evening. The sounds of expensive sound systems playing music Margaret didn't recognize. The click of high heels across hardwood floors that Victoria had installed because she found carpet too pedestrian for her sophisticated lifestyle. The building's thin walls and floors meant that Margaret was constantly aware of Victoria's presence just 2 floors above, yet they lived as strangers. Victoria had installed private elevator access to avoid sharing the regular elevator with other residents, a decision that stung Margaret deeply because it meant her daughter was actively seeking to avoid any chance encounters with her. When they did encounter each other in the building's lobby or mailroom, Victoria's demeanor was strained and awkward, as if she were embarrassed to be seen with Margaret in front of the other residents. She would cut conversations short with transparent excuses about urgent business calls or important meetings, her eyes darting around to see who might be witnessing her interaction with her obviously lower-class mother. Margaret had tried to bridge the growing gap between them by continuing the traditions that had once brought them together. She still cooked Victoria's favorite meals, the pot roast with vegetables that Victoria had loved as a child, the apple pie that had been her requested birthday dessert for 15 consecutive years. But when Margaret would leave these offerings outside Victoria's door, they would often sit there for days before disappearing, and Victoria never acknowledged receiving them. The church ladies at St. Mary's had begun to notice Margaret's isolation and sadness, though Margaret tried to hide her pain behind smiles and vague explanations about Victoria being very busy with her career. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had known Margaret for 20 years, was the most direct in her concern. "Mija, when was the last time that daughter of yours came to see you properly? Not just rushing past in the hallway, but really sitting down and spending time with her mother." Margaret couldn't remember the last time Victoria had willingly spent more than 10 minutes in her presence. Even their phone conversations had become perfunctory exchanges of basic information, Victoria calling to ask if Margaret needed anything from the grocery store. She always said no, knowing Victoria resented even these minimal gestures of care, or Margaret calling to check on Victoria's health or work, only to be told that everything was fine in a tone that suggested the conversation should end as quickly as possible. The loneliness was overwhelming at times. Margaret had friends at church and neighbors who were kind to her, but nothing could replace the relationship with the daughter she had poured her entire life into raising. She found herself having conversations with Victoria's childhood photographs, telling the smiling little girl in the pictures about her day, sharing worries and joys with someone who no longer existed except in memory. Margaret had kept every card Victoria had ever made for her, every school project that had been sent home, every letter Victoria had written during her college years when she had seemed grateful and loving and eager to share her experiences with her mother. She would reread these old letters sometimes, searching for clues about when and how Victoria had changed, trying to understand what she might have done differently to prevent this devastating transformation. One letter, written during Victoria's sophomore year of college, was particularly painful to read now. "Dear Mom, I know I don't tell you this enough, but I think about you every day and how hard you've worked to give me this opportunity. I see other kids here whose parents just write checks for everything, and they take it all for granted. But I never forget that every class I attend, every book I read, every opportunity one have is because you sacrifice so much for me. I promise I'll make you proud. And someday I'll be able to take care of you the way you've taken care of me. I love you more than words can say. Your grateful daughter, Victoria. Margaret had read that letter so many times that the paper was soft and creased from handling. The promise to take care of you the way you've taken care of me felt like a cruel joke now, when Victoria could barely tolerate being in the same room with her, when Margaret's financial struggles seemed to irritate rather than concern her daughter. The physical pain of Margaret's arthritis was manageable compared to the emotional pain of watching her daughter transform into someone she didn't recognize. Victoria had become successful, wealthy, sophisticated. All the things Margaret had dreamed she might become. But in achieving those external markers of success, Victoria seemed to have lost the capacity for gratitude, compassion, and genuine human connection that Margaret had tried so hard to instill in her. Margaret found herself grieving for the daughter she had lost, even though Victoria was still alive and living just 2 floors away. The Victoria who existed now felt like a stranger wearing her daughter's face, someone who shared DNA but no longer shared values, someone who had achieved everything Margaret had worked to give her but had forgotten the source of those achievements. The afternoons were the hardest time. That was when Margaret would sit in her small living room, surrounded by the evidence of 30 years of unconditional love, trying to reconcile the child she had raised with the adult that child had become. She would hold the old photographs and whisper prayers for Victoria's happiness, even as her heart broke from the realization that her own presence in Victoria's life had become nothing more than an unwanted reminder of a past her daughter was determined to escape. The sound of Victoria's heels clicking across the floor above served as a constant reminder of how close they were physically and how far apart they had grown emotionally. Margaret would hear her daughter's voice through the thin walls, animated and warm when she spoke to friends or colleagues on the phone, and it would remind her of the loving, enthusiastic person Victoria could still be, just not with her mother. As evening approached and the shadows grew longer across Margaret's small apartment, she carefully closed the photo albums and put them away, each one a chapter in a story that seemed to have taken a tragic turn. Tomorrow would bring another day of hoping Victoria might remember the love that had shaped her. Another day of living in the same building as her daughter while feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. Margaret's greatest fear wasn't her own loneliness or financial struggles. It was the realization that in trying to give Victoria everything she needed to succeed in the world, she might have failed to give her the one thing that mattered most: the understanding that love and family were more valuable than any material achievement. But that fear paled in comparison to what was about to happen, to the moment when Victoria's casual cruelty would cross a line that could never be uncrossed, when the daughter Margaret had sacrificed everything for would reveal just how completely she had forgotten the woman who had given her everything. The evening light faded from Margaret's small window as she prepared for bed, unaware that tomorrow would bring a betrayal so devastating that it would shatter not just her heart, but her faith in the fundamental goodness she had tried so hard to nurture in the child who no longer seemed to exist. The society pages of the Metropolitan Herald spread across Margaret's small kitchen table like a glossy monument to everything she had never been able to provide for her daughter. The headline read, "Ashworth-Martinez Engagement Celebrates Union of Business Dynasties," accompanied by a photograph that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat with its painful beauty. Victoria stood radiant in a champagne-colored designer gown that probably cost more than Margaret's entire annual income. Her arm elegantly linked through Richard Ashworth's as they posed beneath crystal chandeliers in the grand ballroom of the Ashworth Hotel. Her daughter's smile was brilliant and confident, the smile of someone who belonged in such surroundings, someone who had never known want or struggle or the exhaustion of working 3 jobs just to survive. Margaret studied every detail of the photograph with the intensity of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. Victoria's hair was professionally styled in an elaborate updo that must have taken hours to achieve. Her makeup was flawless, applied by artists who understood how to make beautiful women look like goddesses. The jewelry she wore, diamond earrings that caught the light like captured stars, a necklace that nestled against her throat like liquid moonlight, represented more wealth than Margaret had ever seen in one place. But it was Victoria's expression that cut Margaret most deeply. There was no shadow of sadness in those dark eyes, no hint of regret or longing for the mother who should have been standing beside her on the most important night of her life. Victoria looked complete, fulfilled, perfectly content with her new world and the family that was welcoming her into their golden circle. Margaret's neighbor Maria had brought the newspaper over, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the table between them. Maria was 73, a widow who had raised 6 children on a housekeeper's salary, and she understood better than most the complex pain of watching children outgrow not just their childhood homes but the parents who had sacrificed everything to raise them. "She looks beautiful, doesn't she?" Maria said softly, her voice carefully neutral in the way that kind people speak when they're trying not to add to someone's obvious pain. "She does," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "She looks exactly the way I always dreamed she would look on her wedding day. Like a princess from one of those fairy tales I used to read to her." What Margaret couldn't say without breaking down completely, was that in all those fairy tales, in all those childhood dreams about Victoria's future wedding, Margaret had always pictured herself there. Maybe not in a designer gown or dripping with diamonds, but there nonetheless, watching with proud tears as her daughter promised her life to someone who would love and cherish her. The newspaper article provided details that felt like individual daggers to Margaret's already wounded heart. The guest list read like a who's who of the city's elite: Mayor Patterson and his wife, the Chandler family whose oil fortune dated back 3 generations, tech entrepreneur Marcus Webb, whose company had recently gone public, philanthropist Elizabeth Morrison, whose charity galas raised millions for causes Margaret had only read about in these same society pages. 200 guests had attended the engagement party, each one deemed worthy of witnessing Victoria's triumph, each one apparently more deserving of a place at this celebration than the woman who had made it all possible. The menu had been crafted by James Crawford, the celebrity chef whose restaurant reservations were booked months in advance. The flowers, white roses and orchids flown in from Ecuador, had been arranged by Sophia's Garden, the florist whose work graced only the most exclusive events in the city. Margaret calculated unconsciously, a habit formed by decades of poverty. The flowers alone had probably cost more than her monthly pension. The catering for 200 people at the Ashworth Hotel would have been enough to pay her rent for a year. The photographer whose artistic black and white images accompanied the article charged more for a single event than Margaret had earned in any given year of her working life. But the most painful detail wasn't financial. It was personal. The article quoted Victoria extensively, describing her overwhelming gratitude to the Ashworth family for welcoming her with such warmth, and her excitement about finally finding the family she had always dreamed of being part of. Finally finding the family she had always dreamed of. As if the family that had raised her, the mother who had worked herself into disability to provide for her, had never existed at all. Margaret's hands shook as she turned to the second page of coverage, where more photographs showed Victoria and Richard cutting an engagement cake that was a work of art in itself. 5 tiers of white fondant decorated with sugar flowers so realistic they looked like they might have fragrance. Victoria's face in these pictures was luminous with joy, unmarked by any awareness that someone was missing from this perfect tableau. "Did she?" Maria began carefully, then stopped, unsure how to ask the question that hung in the air between them. "No," Margaret said, answering the unspoken inquiry. "She didn't tell me about it. I found out the same way you did, from the newspaper." The admission hung between them like a confession of some shameful secret. What kind of daughter plans and executes an engagement party without informing her own mother? What kind of relationship had their bond deteriorated into that such exclusion was not only possible but apparently natural to Victoria? Maria's weathered face creased with sympathy and something that looked like anger. "Mija, that's not right. I don't care how fancy her life has become, you're still her mother. You're the one who raised her, who sacrificed everything." "She's found her place in the world," Margaret interrupted gently, though her voice carried the weight of unshed tears. "This is what I worked for, isn't it? For her to be successful, to marry well, to never have to struggle the way I did." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew they were hollow comfort. Success and security were meant to enhance family bonds, not destroy them. Victoria's achievements should have been a source of shared joy, a testament to the love and sacrifice that had made them possible. Instead, they had become a wall between mother and daughter, each of Victoria's accomplishments seemingly requiring the erasure of another piece of their shared history. Margaret turned to the third page of coverage, where the society columnist had written a breathless account of the evening's highlights. The description read like something from a romance novel. The Ashworth Hotel's grand ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland for the evening, with thousands of white roses creating an atmosphere of ethereal beauty. Miss Martinez, stunning in a custom Valentino gown, moved through the crowd with the natural grace of someone born to this world of elegance and refinement. Born to this world. As if Victoria's poise and confidence were genetic gifts rather than the result of Margaret's careful instruction in manners. Her insistence that Victoria speak properly. Her tireless work to ensure her daughter would be comfortable in any social situation. Margaret had taught Victoria how to set a table properly by practicing with mismatched dishes and plastic utensils. She had shown her how to walk with confidence by having her practice in the narrow hallway of their tiny apartment. She had instilled in Victoria the importance of thank you notes and proper grammar and treating everyone with respect, regardless of their station in life. All of those lessons had apparently taken root, but the woman who had taught them had been deemed unworthy of witnessing their application in this grand setting. Margaret studied the photographs more closely, searching for some sign that Victoria had felt her absence, some shadow across her perfect features that might indicate regret or longing for her mother's presence. But Victoria's joy appeared complete and unmarred by any sense of loss. If anything, she looked liberated, free to inhabit this new identity without the inconvenient reminder of her humble origins. The guest list included several people Margaret recognized from Victoria's college years, sorority sisters who had come from wealthy families, classmates whose parents had been able to write tuition checks without sacrificing basic necessities. These were the people Victoria had maintained friendships with, the ones whose backgrounds didn't embarrass her, whose family stories enhanced rather than detracted from her social standing. Margaret remembered some of these names from Victoria's college stories. There was Catherine Whitmore, whose father owned a chain of luxury hotels, and who had never worked a day in her life but spoke passionately about finding her purpose through various charitable endeavors. There was Jennifer Blackstone, whose trust fund allowed her to pursue art history as a hobby while maintaining a lifestyle that included European vacations and a Manhattan apartment her parents had purchased as a graduation gift. These women had been Victoria's friends during a time when Margaret had still been included in her daughter's life, when Victoria would come home for weekends and holidays with stories about her sophisticated classmates and their glamorous lifestyles. Margaret had encouraged these friendships, thinking it was good for Victoria to expand her social circle, to learn from people who had grown up with advantages Margaret couldn't provide. She hadn't realized that these relationships were also teaching Victoria to be ashamed of her own background, to see Margaret's working-class values and modest circumstances as obstacles to overcome rather than foundations to build upon. The society columnist's description of Richard was particularly galling. Mr. Ashworth, heir to one of the city's most prominent real estate fortunes, has found in Miss Martinez not only a beautiful and accomplished partner but someone who shares his commitment to philanthropy and community service. The couple plans to establish a foundation focused on educational opportunities for underprivileged children, a cause close to both their hearts. Educational opportunities for underprivileged children, like the opportunities Margaret had fought to provide for Victoria, working herself to exhaustion to ensure her daughter could attend the best schools, taking out loans she was still paying off to cover college expenses, sacrificing her own health and comfort so Victoria could have the foundation that made this successful life possible. The irony was breathtaking. Victoria would now use her wealth and position to help children like she had once been, but she couldn't acknowledge or honor the woman who had been her own salvation, who had already proven that love and determination could overcome poverty and provide the education that changed everything. Margaret closed her eyes and tried to imagine what the evening had been like. The grand ballroom of the Ashworth Hotel was legendary in the city, a space that had hosted presidents and movie stars, business magnates and foreign dignitaries. The crystal chandeliers had witnessed a century of celebrations, and the marble floors had been walked by some of the most powerful and influential people in the country. Victoria would have entered on Richard's arm, her head held high, completely comfortable in surroundings that would have intimidated Margaret into speechlessness. She would have moved through the crowd with confidence, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who saw her as an equal, as someone who belonged in their exclusive circle. The champagne would have been vintage Dom Perignon, served in crystal flutes that caught the light like prisms. The hors d'oeuvres would have been crafted by artists who transformed simple ingredients into edible masterpieces. The music would have been provided by a string quartet whose members had trained at conservatories Margaret had never heard of, playing compositions that spoke of centuries of cultural refinement. Margaret tried to picture herself in such a setting and felt her chest tighten with anxiety. She would have been terrified of saying the wrong thing, wearing the wrong clothes, using the wrong fork. Her hands would have shaken from nervousness as much as arthritis, and her simple dress, the nicest one she owned, would have looked shabby and out of place among the designer gowns and expensive jewelry. Maybe Victoria had been right to exclude her. Maybe Margaret's presence would have detracted from the perfection of the evening, would have reminded everyone present that Victoria hadn't always lived in this rarefied world of privilege and sophistication. But even as she tried to rationalize her exclusion, Margaret's heart rebelled against the logic. She was Victoria's mother. She had earned the right to witness her daughter's happiness through 30 years of unconditional love and sacrifice. Her presence might have been humble, but it would have been authentic, rooted in decades of shared history and genuine affection. The photographs showed Victoria's future mother-in-law, Eleanor Ashworth, standing beside her with obvious pride and affection. Eleanor was elegantly dressed in navy silk, her silver hair perfectly styled, her jewelry tasteful and obviously expensive. She had the kind of understated sophistication that came from being born into wealth, a natural comfort with luxury that couldn't be learned or imitated. Margaret studied Eleanor's face, searching for clues about the kind of woman who would soon become Victoria's primary female role model. She appeared kind but reserved, someone who valued tradition and propriety, who understood the responsibilities that came with wealth and position. In many ways, she seemed like everything Margaret wasn't: refined instead of rough around the edges, wealthy instead of struggling, sophisticated instead of simple. But Margaret wondered if Eleanor had ever worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over her family's head. Had she ever chosen between buying groceries and paying for her child's school supplies? Had she ever held a sick child through the night while worrying about taking time off work to care for her? Had she ever sacrificed her own dreams so completely that she forgot she had ever had any? Margaret's love for Victoria had been forged in the crucible of necessity and hardship. Every moment of joy had been earned through struggle, every opportunity created through sacrifice. Eleanor's love, whatever its depth, had been expressed through privilege and comfort, through opportunities that money could buy and doors that wealth could open. Both kinds of love were valid, but only one had created the foundation that made Victoria's success possible. Only one had transformed a widowed mother's determination into a daughter's achievements. And only one was being honored and celebrated in these photographs while the other was being systematically erased. The evening had apparently ended with dancing, the photograph showing Victoria and Richard spinning across the marble floor while guests looked on with approval and delight. Victoria's face was radiant with happiness, her designer gown swirling around her like something from a fairy tale. She looked like she had been born to such moments, as if she had always belonged in ballrooms and crystal chandeliers and circles of wealthy, powerful people. Margaret closed the newspaper and sat in the silence of her small apartment, the contrast between her modest surroundings and the luxury depicted in those photographs almost overwhelming. The sounds of the city filtered through her thin walls: traffic, sirens, the occasional argument from neighboring apartments, a symphony of urban struggle that had nothing in common with the refined atmosphere of Victoria's new world. But it was the silence from above that hurt most. Victoria had returned from her triumph to the penthouse apartment 2 floors up, but there had been no phone call to share her joy with her mother, no visit to show off her engagement ring or describe the magical evening. Margaret was literally living beneath her daughter's feet, but she might as well have been on another planet for all the connection they shared. Margaret found herself wondering about the conversations that had taken place at the party. Had anyone asked Victoria about her family? Had Victoria mentioned having a mother, or had she allowed people to assume she was an orphan, someone who had risen from nothing through her own determination and talent? The thought that Victoria might have actively denied her existence was almost too painful to contemplate, but Margaret couldn't shake the suspicion that her daughter had found ways to avoid discussing her background entirely. Victoria had become skilled at deflecting personal questions, at steering conversations toward topics that didn't require acknowledgement of her humble origins. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret began to feel a strange disconnection from her own life, as if she were viewing it from outside her body. The woman in the small apartment surrounded by thrift store furniture and faded photographs seemed like someone from a different world than the mother of the radiant bride to be in the society pages. How had the same story produced such divergent endings? The physical pain in Margaret's joints seemed to intensify as the emotional pain deepened, as if her body were responding to the stress of confronting such complete rejection. She took her afternoon medication with hands that shook more than usual, washing down the pills with lukewarm tea because her electric bill was already too high to justify heating water for anything beyond basic necessity. Outside her window, the city continued its relentless pace, people hurrying past with purposes and destinations that seemed to matter in ways Margaret's existence no longer did. She had spent 30 years being the most important person in Victoria's life, and now she was less significant than the strangers who had been invited to celebrate her daughter's engagement. The cruelest irony was that Margaret's sacrifices had been successful beyond her wildest dreams. Victoria was beautiful, accomplished, sophisticated, and wealthy, everything Margaret had worked to help her become. But in achieving these goals, Victoria had apparently concluded that the person who made them possible was an embarrassment to be hidden rather than a treasure to be honored. Margaret tried to imagine what James would say if he could see their daughter now. Would he be proud of Victoria's success? Or would he be heartbroken by her transformation into someone who could forget the love that had shaped her? Would he understand Margaret's pain? Or would he encourage her to be grateful for Victoria's achievements regardless of the personal cost? As evening approached, Margaret could hear the sounds of another gathering beginning in Victoria's penthouse. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses that suggested more celebration was taking place. Victoria was apparently extending her engagement festivities into a weekend of parties, each one another opportunity to solidify her place in her new social circle. Margaret wondered if Victoria ever thought about her during these celebrations, if there were moments when she felt the absence of the woman who had loved her first and most completely. Or had Victoria's transformation been so complete that she no longer even registered Margaret's exclusion as unusual or hurtful? The newspaper photographs had captured Victoria at the pinnacle of her social triumph, but they had also documented the final severing of the bond between mother and daughter. Margaret was looking at evidence of her own erasure from Victoria's life, proof that her 30 years of love and sacrifice had culminated not in gratitude and inclusion but in shame and rejection. As the sounds of celebration continued from above, Margaret sat in her modest living room and grieved for the relationship that had defined her entire adult life. The daughter she had raised was gone, replaced by someone who valued appearances over authenticity, wealth over love, social status over family bonds. The engagement party had been Victoria's introduction to the highest levels of society, but it had also been her final goodbye to the world that had created her. Margaret understood now that there would be no place for her in Victoria's future, no role for the mother who had made everything possible. But what Margaret didn't yet realize was that the worst was still to come, that Victoria's cruelty had depths that even this devastating exclusion hadn't fully revealed. The engagement party was just the beginning of a rejection so complete and heartless that it would challenge everything Margaret thought she knew about the daughter she had loved with every fiber of her being. The evening light faded from Margaret's small window as she sat surrounded by the evidence of her daughter's triumph and her own irrelevance, unaware that the morning would bring words so cruel they would shatter not just her heart but her very understanding of what it meant to be a mother whose love had been forgotten, whose sacrifices had been deemed worthless, whose existence had become nothing more than an inconvenience to be hidden away. The morning after discovering Victoria's engagement celebration in the society pages, Margaret found herself unable to sleep past 4 a.m. Her arthritis flaring with the emotional stress of the previous day's revelations. She moved slowly through her small apartment, the walker's soft scraping against the linoleum floor the only sound breaking the pre-dawn silence that seemed to amplify her loneliness. As she prepared her morning tea, the same ritual that had grounded her for decades, Margaret heard footsteps in the building's hallway, followed by a gentle knock on her door. Her heart leaped momentarily with the impossible hope that it might be Victoria, coming to apologize for the exclusion, to share her joy belatedly with the mother who had made it all possible. Instead, she opened the door to find Daniel Rodriguez, the building's 25-year-old maintenance supervisor, holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression of genuine concern that had become increasingly rare in Margaret's daily interactions. "Mrs. Martinez," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying the respectful warmth that his own grandmother had taught him to show toward elders. "I saw your light on early and thought you might like some company. My abuela always said that 4 a.m. is too early to face troubles alone." Daniel was everything Victoria had once been but no longer was: kind, grateful, aware of the sacrifices others made for family. He worked 2 jobs to support his younger siblings after their parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, taking night classes at the community college while maintaining the building during the day and stocking shelves at a grocery store 3 evenings a week. Margaret had watched Daniel transform from a grief-stricken 22-year-old into a responsible young man who carried burdens far beyond his years with grace and determination. He reminded her of herself at that age, stepping up to impossible circumstances with nothing but love and stubborn refusal to give up on the people who depended on him. "You're very kind, Daniel," Margaret said, stepping aside to let him enter her small apartment. "But you should be sleeping. You work too hard as it is." Daniel smiled, settling into the chair across from Margaret's worn sofa with the easy familiarity of someone who had become like family over the past year. "Sleep is overrated when there are people who matter who might need a friend." The simple statement hit Margaret like a revelation. When had she last heard someone speak about people mattering? When had anyone last suggested that she might need a friend, or that her well-being was worth losing sleep over? "I saw the newspaper yesterday," Daniel continued gently, his dark eyes reflecting understanding that seemed far beyond his years. "Congratulations on your daughter's engagement. She looked beautiful in the pictures." Margaret felt tears threatening and fought them back, not wanting to burden this young man with her pain. She did look beautiful. The party was very elegant. "But you weren't there," Daniel said simply, not making it a question because the absence had been obvious to anyone who knew Margaret's relationship with Victoria. The words hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of a hurt so profound that Margaret had been unable to speak it aloud even to herself. Daniel's gentle directness was like lancing a wound that had been festering in silence. "No," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wasn't there." Daniel leaned forward, his expression intensely serious. "Mrs. Martinez, I want you to know something. My mama used to tell me that the measure of a person isn't in what they achieve, but in how they treat the people who help them achieve it. You raised that girl, you sacrificed everything for her education and opportunities. What she's done to you, it's not right." The validation felt like cool water on a burning wound. For months, Margaret had been questioning herself, wondering if she was being overly sensitive, if Victoria's distance and eventual exclusion were somehow justified by Margaret's limitations and modest circumstances. "But she's successful," Margaret said, voicing the rationalization she had been using to excuse Victoria's behavior. "She's accomplished everything I worked for her to accomplish. Maybe she's outgrown the need for love." Daniel interrupted gently. "For family. For the woman who made it all possible." He shook his head firmly. "Success that comes at the cost of forgetting where you came from isn't success at all, Mrs. Martinez. It's just expensive loneliness." Daniel's words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned early that material achievements meant nothing without people to share them with, that the struggle to provide for family was what gave life meaning rather than what made it burdensome. Over the next 2 hours, as the sun gradually lightened Margaret's small kitchen, Daniel shared stories about his own family struggles. His determination to ensure his younger siblings never forgot the sacrifices their parents had made. His commitment to maintaining family bonds even when success might make it easier to leave his humble origins behind. "When I finish college and get a better job," Daniel said, "I'm not going to be embarrassed about this building or the grocery store or any of it. These experiences made me who I am. The people who helped me when things were hardest, they're the ones who deserve to celebrate with me when things get better." Margaret found herself remembering the Victoria who had once shared Daniel's values, the young woman who had written letters from college expressing gratitude for Margaret's sacrifices, who had promised to take care of her mother the way her mother had taken care of her. That Victoria had existed, had been real, had possessed the same understanding of family loyalty that Daniel demonstrated so naturally. What happened to her? Margaret asked, more to herself than to Daniel. She wasn't always like this. She used to be grateful, loving, aware of what we'd been through together. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness that characterized all his interactions. I think sometimes when people get successful, they start believing they did it all themselves. They forget the foundation other people built for them because remembering would mean acknowledging that they owe something to people who can't help their image anymore. The analysis was devastating in its accuracy. Victoria had indeed begun to rewrite her own history, transforming her narrative from daughter whose mother's sacrifices made success possible to self-made woman who overcame humble beginnings through her own determination. In this revised version, Margaret wasn't a hero to be honored but an obstacle that had been successfully overcome. But forgetting where you come from, Daniel continued, it's like cutting the roots off a tree. You might look taller for a while, but eventually you fall over because you have nothing anchoring you to the ground. As if summoned by their conversation about Victoria, the sound of high heels clicking across the floor above interrupted their quiet morning dialogue. Victoria was apparently starting her day, preparing for another round of celebrations and social obligations that would continue to cement her place in her new world. Daniel noticed Margaret's involuntary glance toward the ceiling, and the way her expression shifted from openness to guarded pain. "She's right there," he said softly, "but she might as well be on another planet. Sometimes I think it would hurt less if she actually lived far away," Margaret admitted. "Knowing she's so close but so completely unavailable. It's like being haunted by the ghost of your own child." The sounds from above continued. Water running, music playing, the general bustle of someone preparing for a busy day. Margaret found herself unconsciously tracking Victoria's movements through the apartment, a habit developed over months of longing for connection with a daughter who lived just 2 floors away but never visited. Daniel seemed to understand the torture of this proximity without intimacy. "My cousin went through something similar with her son when he got rich. Started pretending like he didn't know her when they'd run into each other around town. You know what she finally did?" Margaret shook her head, curious about any strategy that might have worked in a similar situation. She stopped making excuses for him. Started telling people the truth about what he was doing. Not to hurt him, but because keeping his secrets was making her complicit in her own mistreatment. The suggestion was both liberating and terrifying. Margaret had been protecting Victoria's reputation by maintaining silence about their estranged relationship, making vague excuses when church friends asked why Victoria never visited, deflecting questions about why she hadn't been at the engagement party. "I couldn't embarrass her like that," Margaret said automatically, the response of a mother who had spent 3 decades putting her daughter's needs before her own. "But she's already embarrassed you," Daniel pointed out gently. "She's made you invisible, Mrs. Martinez. She's treating you like you don't exist. At what point do you stop protecting someone who won't protect you?" The question lingered in the air as Victoria's footsteps moved toward what Margaret knew was the private elevator that allowed her daughter to avoid any possibility of encountering other residents, including her mother, in the building's common areas. Daniel glanced at his watch and sighed. "I need to get to my morning classes. But I want you to promise me something, Mrs. Martinez. Promise me you'll stop making excuses for behavior that's inexcusable. You deserve better than this." After Daniel left, Margaret sat in her small kitchen surrounded by the lingering warmth of genuine human connection, something she hadn't experienced from her own daughter in months. Daniel's visit had been like a shaft of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, reminding her that kindness and respect still existed in the world, even if they no longer existed in her relationship with Victoria. But the respite was temporary. Within an hour of Daniel's departure, Margaret's fragile hope was shattered by an encounter that would reveal the true depths of Victoria's transformation from grateful daughter to cruel stranger. Margaret had decided to venture out for groceries, partly because she needed supplies and partly because Daniel's encouragement had given her a temporary boost of energy and determination. She made her way slowly to the building's lobby, her walker helping her navigate the hallway she had traversed thousands of times over the years. As she approached the elevator, she could hear voices from the other side of the lobby. Victoria's voice, animated and cheerful as she spoke to someone Margaret couldn't see. Margaret's heart leaped with involuntary hope. Perhaps this would be an opportunity for a natural encounter, a chance to congratulate Victoria on her engagement and begin healing the rift between them. But as Margaret drew closer, Victoria's words became clear, and they struck her like physical blows. Honestly, it's such a relief to be moving forward with my life without having to worry about complications from my past. Richard's family has been so welcoming, and I finally feel like I'm exactly where I belong. Sometimes you have to make clean breaks from things that hold you back, you know. The person Victoria was speaking to, Margaret could now see it was Jennifer Blackstone, one of Victoria's college friends whose trust fund had funded a lifestyle of perpetual leisure, responded with knowing laughter. I totally understand. It's so freeing when you can finally live authentically instead of being dragged down by obligations that don't serve your growth. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she realized she was the complication and obligation they were discussing so casually. She was the thing from Victoria's past that needed to be eliminated for her daughter to live authentically. But Victoria wasn't finished. As Margaret stood frozen in the lobby, her walker suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, her daughter continued with casual cruelty that took Margaret's breath away. The best part is that Richard's family just assumes I'm self-made, that I overcame disadvantages through my own determination. They have no idea about the messier parts of my background. And honestly, why should they? The past is the past, and some things are better left buried. Margaret's hands began to shake uncontrollably as she processed what she was hearing. Victoria wasn't just excluding her from celebrations. She was actively denying Margaret's existence, rewriting their shared history to eliminate any acknowledgement of the love and sacrifice that had made Victoria's success possible. Jennifer's response was even more cutting. You're so right to move on. I mean, what's the point of dwelling on people and situations that can't contribute to your future? It's actually kind of inspiring how completely you've reinvented yourself. Completely reinvented. As if Victoria's entire identity before meeting Richard had been something shameful that needed to be discarded rather than honored. As if 30 years of Margaret's unconditional love were nothing more than an embarrassing phase that sophisticated people moved beyond. Margaret realized she was witnessing her own eulogy, delivered by the daughter she had raised, to an audience that saw her elimination from Victoria's life as evidence of maturity and growth rather than cruelty and ingratitude. The physical impact of hearing these words was immediate and overwhelming. Margaret felt her chest tighten, her breathing become shallow and rapid. Her vision blur at the edges as the full magnitude of Victoria's betrayal crashed over her like a tsunami. She turned her walker around and began moving as quickly as her failing body would allow back toward the elevator, desperate to escape before Victoria noticed her presence and realized that Margaret had overheard her casual assassination of their relationship. But Margaret's retreat wasn't quick enough. As she waited for the elevator, fighting to control her breathing and the trembling that had taken over her entire body, she heard Victoria's voice behind her. Mother, what are you doing down here? The tone was sharp with annoyance rather than warm with affection, as if Margaret's presence in the lobby of her own building was somehow inappropriate or inconvenient. Margaret turned slowly, her face pale but composed through decades of practice at hiding pain. Victoria stood 10 feet away, elegant in designer clothes that cost more than Margaret's monthly income. Her expression a mixture of irritation and something that looked almost like panic at being caught in the proximity of the mother she had just finished denying. I was going to the store, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria glanced nervously toward Jennifer, who was watching this interaction with undisguised curiosity. Margaret could see her daughter calculating, trying to determine how to handle this unexpected encounter without damaging the image she had been so carefully constructing. Well, be careful, Victoria said dismissively, already turning back toward her friend. The neighborhood can be challenging for someone in your condition. The words were delivered with perfunctory concern that fooled no one, least of all Margaret, who recognized them as Victoria's attempt to establish emotional distance while appearing appropriately dutiful in front of a witness. Margaret nodded silently and stepped into the elevator when it finally arrived, her legs barely supporting her weight as the doors closed between her and the daughter who had just publicly erased her from existence. The ride to her floor felt eternal, each second stretched thin by the magnitude of what she had just experienced. Victoria hadn't just excluded her from the engagement party. She had eliminated her from the narrative entirely, transforming Margaret's decades of sacrifice into nothing more than embarrassing baggage to be discarded. By the time Margaret reached her apartment, her body was shutting down under the combined assault of emotional trauma and physical stress. She barely made it to her bedroom before collapsing onto the bed, her breathing labored and her heart racing with irregular rhythms that spoke of a system pushed beyond its limits. As consciousness began to fade around the edges, Margaret's last coherent thought was a prayer not for herself, but for the daughter who had become so lost in her pursuit of social acceptance that she could casually destroy the person who had loved her most completely. The afternoon sun streamed through Margaret's small bedroom window as she drifted in and out of consciousness, her body finally surrendering to the accumulation of stress, heartbreak, and the progressive toll of her medical conditions. She was dimly aware of the sounds of the building around her. Footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations, the distant hum of traffic from the street below. But what she couldn't hear, couldn't know as she fought for each breath, was that her collapse had been witnessed by someone who cared about her well-being, someone who would refuse to let her face this crisis alone. Daniel had returned from his morning classes to find Margaret's apartment door slightly ajar, a detail that immediately alarmed him because he knew how carefully security-conscious she was. His knock had gone unanswered, and his calls of Mrs. Martinez had been met with silence that made his stomach clench with worry. Finding Margaret unconscious on her bed, Daniel didn't hesitate. He called 911 while checking her pulse and breathing, his own heart racing as he realized how close he might have come to losing someone who had become like family to him. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of emotions Daniel was fighting to control. As they worked to stabilize Margaret and prepare her for transport to the hospital, Daniel found himself thinking about Victoria, 2 floors above, probably unaware that her mother was fighting for her life. He considered going upstairs to inform Victoria about the emergency, but something held him back. The woman who could speak so casually about cutting ties with her past, who could dismiss her mother as a complication to be eliminated, might not welcome the interruption to her perfectly curated new life. Instead, Daniel rode with Margaret in the ambulance, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering reassurances that someone cared, that she wasn't alone, that help was coming. At the hospital, as doctors worked to determine the extent of Margaret's medical crisis, Daniel found himself in the unexpected role of family member, the only person present who could speak to Margaret's recent emotional state and the stress factors that might have contributed to her collapse. "She's been under tremendous emotional strain," he told the attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, who listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to seeing the physical manifestations of psychological trauma. "Her daughter has been difficult, very difficult. And yesterday Mrs. Martinez discovered some particularly hurtful information that seemed to devastate her." Dr. Chen nodded knowingly. She had seen enough elderly patients whose medical crises were triggered or worsened by family stress to recognize the pattern. Emotional trauma can absolutely manifest as physical symptoms, especially in someone with her pre-existing conditions. Has she been eating regularly? Sleeping? Daniel realized he didn't know the answers to these basic questions, a reminder of how isolated Margaret had become even from the people who cared about her. "I don't think so. She's been very withdrawn lately, and I know she worries about money for groceries." The picture that emerged from Daniel's observations and the medical examination was of someone whose body had been pushed beyond its limits by the combination of chronic illness, financial stress, and devastating emotional trauma. Margaret wasn't just having a medical emergency. She was experiencing the physical breakdown that occurred when a human system could no longer cope with accumulated pain. As Margaret stabilized and was moved to a regular room, Daniel settled into the bedside chair for what he expected to be a long vigil. He had called his supervisor to explain that he wouldn't be able to work his evening shift, accepting the financial hit because Margaret's well-being was more important than his paycheck. Hours passed before Margaret's eyes fluttered open, her vision slowly focusing on Daniel's concerned face beside her bed. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice hoarse and confused. "What?" "You collapsed, Mrs. Martinez. You're in the hospital, but you're going to be okay." Daniel squeezed her hand gently, relief flooding through him as her eyes gained clarity and focus. Margaret tried to sit up but found herself too weak to manage more than lifting her head slightly. The events of the morning came flooding back. Victoria's casual cruelty, the public denial of Margaret's existence, the overwhelming realization that her daughter had completely erased her from the narrative of her own success. "She said I was buried," Margaret whispered, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "She said the past was better left buried, and I'm the past she's talking about." Daniel felt his own eyes fill with tears as he witnessed the devastating impact of Victoria's words on the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her. "Mrs. Martinez, what Victoria said doesn't change who you are or what you've done. You raised a successful, educated, accomplished woman. The fact that she's forgotten how to be grateful doesn't diminish what you achieved." "But she's ashamed of me," Margaret continued, her voice breaking with the weight of finally speaking this truth aloud. "I embarrass her. My disability, my poverty, my simple life. It's all just evidence of a past she wants to forget." Daniel leaned closer, his voice firm despite his own emotional turmoil. "Listen to me, Mrs. Martinez. Victoria's shame isn't about you. It's about her. She's become someone who values appearances over substance, who thinks success means forgetting where you came from. That's her failure, not yours." A nurse entered the room to check Margaret's vital signs, noting with approval that her patient's blood pressure and heart rate were stabilizing. "You gave everyone quite a scare," she said kindly. "But your young man here hasn't left your side. It's nice to see someone who cares so much." "He's not my son," Margaret said softly, looking at Daniel with gratitude that went beyond words. "No," Daniel replied, squeezing her hand again. "But you're the closest thing to a grandmother I've had since mine passed away. Family isn't always about blood, Mrs. Martinez. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most." The simple statement hit Margaret with unexpected force. She had spent so much energy grieving the loss of her relationship with Victoria that she had almost missed the family that was forming around her. Daniel, Maria, the church ladies who checked on her, the neighbors who smiled and asked about her health. These relationships might not have the history and intensity of her bond with Victoria, but they were real, consistent, and based on mutual respect and affection rather than obligation and expectation. "Has anyone contacted your daughter?" the nurse asked, assuming that Victoria would want to be informed about her mother's hospitalization. Daniel and Margaret exchanged glances, both understanding the complexity of that question. Victoria lived 2 floors above Margaret's apartment, close enough to be here within minutes, but emotionally distant enough that her presence was far from guaranteed. "I don't think she needs to be bothered," Margaret said quietly, the words carrying the weight of someone who had finally accepted that her daughter's new life had no room for complications like a sick mother. But Daniel had reached a different conclusion. "Actually, I think she does need to know. Not because we expect her to care, but because she needs to understand the consequences of her choices." Daniel had been raised by parents who believed in accountability, who had taught him that actions had repercussions and that people deserved to face the results of their behavior. Victoria's casual cruelty toward her mother had contributed to a medical emergency, and she should be aware of that fact regardless of how she chose to respond to it. "I'm going to call her," Daniel announced, pulling out his phone before Margaret could protest. Margaret felt a complex mixture of hope and terror as Daniel dialed Victoria's number. Part of her desperately wanted her daughter to come, to show some sign that their relationship still mattered despite everything that had happened. But another part of her feared Victoria's likely response: annoyance at being inconvenienced, resentment at being pulled into what she would probably see as unnecessary drama. The phone rang several times before Victoria answered, her voice crisp and professional. "This is Victoria Martinez. Ms. Martinez, this is Daniel Rodriguez from your building. I'm calling about your mother." There was a pause, followed by Victoria's irritated sigh. "What's wrong now?" The casual dismissal in Victoria's voice was audible even through the phone's speaker, and Margaret felt her heart sink at this confirmation that her daughter saw her primarily as a source of problems rather than as someone deserving of concern. "She collapsed this morning and is currently in the hospital," Daniel said, his own voice carefully controlled despite his anger at Victoria's tone. "I thought you should know." Another pause, longer this time, followed by what sounded like Victoria calculating the social and logistical implications of this information. "Is it serious? I mean, is she? Will she be okay?" The questions were framed in terms of convenience rather than genuine concern, focused on determining whether Victoria would be required to alter her plans rather than on Margaret's well-being. "She's stable now, but the doctors say the collapse was brought on by stress and emotional trauma," Daniel replied, his words carefully chosen to make Victoria understand her role in creating this crisis. "Emotional trauma." Victoria's voice sharpened with what might have been defensiveness or annoyance. "What kind of emotional trauma?" Daniel looked at Margaret, who was listening to this conversation with growing understanding that even her hospitalization was being processed by Victoria primarily in terms of its impact on Victoria's own life. "Maybe you should ask her that yourself," Daniel suggested. "Room 314 at Metropolitan General." I have a very busy schedule today," Victoria began, the excuse forming automatically before she had even considered whether her mother's medical emergency might warrant rearranging her priorities. "I'm sure you do," Daniel replied, his tone conveying exactly what he thought of priorities that didn't include visiting a hospitalized mother. "The choice of whether to come is yours, of course." After Victoria hung up, Margaret and Daniel sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the conversation they had just witnessed. Victoria's response had been exactly what Margaret had feared, but still somehow worse than she had prepared herself for. "She's not coming," Margaret said finally, not making it a question because Victoria's priorities had been made clear. "Maybe not," Daniel agreed. "But if she doesn't come, that tells you everything you need to know about who she's become and what your relationship really means to her." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding that she was facing a moment of truth that had been building for months. Victoria's response to this crisis would be the final test of whether any remnant of the loving daughter Margaret remembered still existed beneath the sophisticated exterior. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself surrounded by unexpected visitors. Maria arrived with homemade soup and worried prayers. Mrs. Patterson from 4B brought flowers and stayed to chat about neighborhood gossip. Several ladies from church stopped by with cards and offers to help with anything Margaret might need. Each visitor brought the same message. Margaret was valued, cared about, and not alone despite her daughter's absence. The community that had formed around her provided a safety net of genuine affection that contrasted sharply with the conditional and ultimately withdrawn love she had experienced from Victoria. But as evening approached and visiting hours began to wind down, Victoria had still not appeared. Margaret tried not to watch the door, tried not to hope that her daughter might still arrive with explanations and apologies and some sign that their relationship could be salvaged. Daniel remained at Margaret's bedside long past official visiting hours, his presence a steady comfort that spoke of loyalty and genuine care. The nurses made exceptions for him, recognizing him as the family member who had actually shown up when it mattered. "You should go home," Margaret told him as the hospital settled into its nighttime quiet. "You've already done so much, and you need to rest." "I'll stay a while longer," Daniel replied, settling more comfortably in his chair. "My abuela used to say that hospitals are scary places to be alone, and everyone deserves to have someone watching over them when they're vulnerable." Margaret felt tears threaten again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than heartbreak. Daniel's kindness was teaching her that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that love could be found in unexpected places when it disappeared from expected ones. As Margaret drifted towards sleep, comforted by Daniel's presence and the steady beeping of monitoring equipment that confirmed her body was healing, she found herself thinking not about Victoria's absence but about the people who had shown up. Maybe this crisis would be the catalyst that finally forced her to stop waiting for Victoria to remember how to love her and start appreciating the people who already did. Maybe losing the daughter she thought she knew would help her discover the family she had been too distracted to fully appreciate. The night sounds of the hospital, soft conversations at the nurse's station, the distant ding of elevators, the quiet footsteps of staff making their rounds, created a soundtrack for Margaret's growing understanding that her story wasn't ending with Victoria's rejection. Instead, it might be beginning a new chapter defined not by the love she had lost but by the love she was learning to recognize and accept from unexpected sources. Margaret awoke on her third morning in the hospital to find Victoria standing awkwardly by the window, her designer outfit and perfect makeup incongruous against the sterile medical setting. For a moment, Margaret thought she might be dreaming. After days of hoping and waiting, her daughter's presence felt surreal. "Hello, Mother," Victoria said stiffly, her voice carrying the formal tone she might use with a business acquaintance rather than the warm affection one would expect between mother and child who hadn't seen each other during a medical crisis. Margaret struggled to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, her heart racing with a combination of hope, anxiety, and the lingering effects of her collapse. "Victoria, you came." "I had some time between appointments," Victoria replied, glancing at her expensive watch as if to emphasize that this visit was a brief interruption in her otherwise busy schedule. "How are you feeling?" The question should have been filled with genuine concern, but Victoria's tone suggested she was fulfilling a social obligation rather than expressing authentic worry about her mother's well-being. Margaret recognized the voice Victoria used with clients and colleagues. Professional, courteous, but emotionally distant. "I'm better, thank you," Margaret said quietly, studying her daughter's face for any sign of the warmth and love that had once defined their relationship. "The doctors say I can probably go home tomorrow." Victoria nodded absently, her attention seeming to drift toward her phone, which had buzzed with what was presumably an important message. Margaret watched her daughter's fingers twitch toward the device before Victoria apparently remembered where she was and forced herself to maintain focus on their conversation. "That's good," Victoria said. "I'm sure you'll be more comfortable in your own place." The exchange felt like dialogue from a play where both actors had forgotten their lines and were improvising their way through a scene neither of them wanted to perform. Margaret found herself searching desperately for some way to bridge the vast emotional distance that had opened between them, some magic words that might restore the connection they had once shared. "Victoria," Margaret began carefully, "I've been thinking about us, about what's happened between us. I know I'm not the mother you might want now, with your new life and your engagement to Richard. I know I embarrass you sometimes, and I understand why you might feel like you need to distance yourself." "Mother, please," Victoria interrupted, her discomfort with the direction of the conversation evident in her sharp tone. "Let's not make this complicated. You're sick, I came to check on you. That's all this needs to be." But Margaret had spent 3 days in this hospital bed thinking about her life, her relationships, and the daughter she had raised with such love and hope. She had reached a clarity that Victoria's presence couldn't diminish and a strength that came from finally accepting the truth about their changed dynamic. "No, Victoria," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "It needs to be more than that because I need to understand what happened to us. I need to understand how the little girl who used to promise to take care of her mama forever became someone who could tell her friends that her past was better left buried." Victoria's face went pale, and Margaret saw the flash of panic in her eyes that confirmed she had indeed overheard that devastating conversation in the lobby. "You were listening to a private conversation." "I was trying to get to the elevator in my own building," Margaret replied firmly. "And I heard my own daughter describe me as a complication from her past that needed to be eliminated so she could live authentically. I heard her erase 30 years of love and sacrifice as if they had never happened." For the first time since entering the room, Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Margaret could see her daughter struggling to find words, to formulate an explanation that would minimize the cruelty of what she had said while maintaining the emotional distance she had worked so hard to establish. "Mother, you have to understand," Victoria began, her voice taking on the patient tone one might use to explain something complicated to a child. "My life now is very different from how things used to be. Richard's family, my colleagues, they have certain expectations. They operate in a world where image and presentation matter enormously. And I don't fit that image," Margaret said, not making it a question because the answer was obvious. Victoria's silence was more devastating than words would have been. Margaret watched her daughter's internal struggle, seeing the conflict between Victoria's ingrained politeness and her genuine desire to confirm that yes, Margaret's disability, poverty, and humble background were incompatible with the sophisticated life Victoria was trying to build. "It's not that simple," Victoria finally said, though her inability to meet Margaret's eyes suggested that it was exactly that simple. "Actually, it is that simple," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're ashamed of me. You're ashamed of where you came from, of the woman who sacrificed everything to give you the opportunities that made your current success possible. You'd rather pretend you're self-made than acknowledge that your achievements were built on someone else's love and labor." Victoria's face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or anger. "You act like I owe you something just because you did what any mother would do." "What any mother would do?" Margaret interrupted, her own anger finally surfacing after months of swallowing hurt and making excuses for Victoria's behavior. "Any mother would work 3 jobs while battling arthritis. Any mother would take out loans she couldn't afford to pay for her daughter's education. Any mother would sell her wedding rings to cover college expenses." Margaret's voice was rising now, carrying the pain and frustration of 3 decades of sacrifices that had been dismissed as ordinary maternal obligation. Other patients and staff in the hallway might have been listening, but Margaret no longer cared about maintaining the dignified silence that had protected Victoria's reputation while destroying her own sense of self-worth. "I gave you everything, Victoria. Everything. My health, my financial security, my own dreams. All of it went to making sure you could have opportunities one never had. And you've repaid that love by treating me like an embarrassing secret to be hidden away." Victoria's composure was completely shattered now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of her mother's raw honesty. "You're being dramatic, Mother. Yes, I've been busy with my engagement and my career, but that doesn't mean—" "I wasn't invited to your engagement party," Margaret said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "Your own mother wasn't invited to celebrate the most important moment of your life because you were embarrassed to have me there." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The truth hung in the air between them like a physical presence, impossible to deny or explain away. Margaret could see in her daughter's eyes the moment when Victoria realized that all her rationalizations and justifications had crumbled under the weight of simple, devastating facts. Victoria began, then stopped, her usual eloquence abandoning her when she needed it most. "You what?" Margaret prompted, her voice no longer angry but filled with the exhausted sadness of someone who had finally stopped fighting an unwinnable battle. "You're sorry. You didn't mean for it to happen this way. You were going to invite me but it slipped your mind." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion Margaret had seen from her daughter in months. But even as Margaret's heart responded instinctively to Victoria's distress, she recognized that these tears were more about Victoria's discomfort at being confronted with her own cruelty than about genuine remorse for the pain she had caused. "Mother, please," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you this much." "But you did mean to hurt me some," Margaret replied with devastating clarity. "You meant to exclude me, to hide me, to erase me from your life story. You just didn't expect to be confronted with the consequences of those choices." The hospital room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Margaret's heart monitor and the distant sounds of activity in the hallway. Victoria stood frozen by the window, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, while Margaret lay in her hospital bed finally speaking truths that had been building inside her for months. "I want you to know something, Victoria," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I forgive you." Victoria's head snapped up, surprise replacing the guilt in her expression. "You what?" "I forgive you for forgetting where you came from. I forgive you for being ashamed of me. I forgive you for choosing your image over our relationship." Margaret paused, drawing strength from a source Victoria had never learned to access. "But I'm not going to enable your behavior anymore." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. I mean, I'm done making excuses for you to people who ask where you are. I'm done pretending that your absence from my life is anything other than your choice. I'm done protecting your reputation by staying silent about how you treat the woman who raised you." Margaret's words carried the quiet authority of someone who had finally found her own strength after decades of giving it away to someone who didn't value it. Victoria recognized this shift immediately, understanding that the mother she had taken for granted, dismissed, and emotionally abused was no longer willing to participate in her own mistreatment. "But I love you," Victoria said desperately, the words tumbling out as she realized she was losing something she had assumed would always be available despite her neglect and cruelty. "No," Margaret replied sadly. "You love the idea of me being available when you need me, grateful for whatever scraps of attention you're willing to provide, and invisible when my presence might inconvenience you. That's not love, Victoria. That's ownership." The distinction hit Victoria like a physical blow. She sank into the visitor's chair beside Margaret's bed. Her designer composure completely shattered as she faced the reality of what she had become and what she had destroyed through her selfish choices. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible. "When I started dating Richard, when I got involved with his family and their world, I just wanted to fit in. I wanted to belong somewhere that felt elevated, important. And I made you feel small," Margaret said, understanding the psychology that had driven Victoria's transformation even as she refused to excuse it. "Not small," Victoria protested, then stopped, recognizing that this was exactly what she had felt. Maybe I did feel like I had to choose between honoring where I came from and building the life I wanted. But you didn't have to choose," Margaret said firmly. "Successful people honor their roots all the time. They acknowledge the sacrifices others made for them. They use their achievements to lift up the people who helped make those achievements possible." Victoria was quiet for a long time, processing the truth of Margaret's words and the devastating realization that her behavior had been a choice rather than a necessity. She could have brought Margaret into her new world with pride. She could have used her success to improve her mother's circumstances. She could have demonstrated that gratitude and sophistication were not mutually exclusive. Instead, she had chosen the coward's path, discarding inconvenient truths and relationships in favor of a fabricated identity that required constant maintenance and protection. "Richard's family," Victoria said finally, her voice hollow. "They would have understood. His mother Eleanor lost her parents when she was young, and she talks all the time about how their sacrifices shaped her values. She would have respected you, would have wanted to meet the woman who raised me." The admission was devastating because it revealed that Victoria's shame hadn't even been necessary from a practical standpoint. The Ashworth family, with their old money values and emphasis on character, would likely have welcomed Margaret warmly, recognizing in her story the kind of noble struggle that their own family mythology celebrated. "So why?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because I was embarrassed," Victoria admitted, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her soul. "Because I was afraid that people would see you and think I was pretending to be something I wasn't. Because I wanted so desperately to belong in that world that I convinced myself I had to erase everything that came before it." The honesty was brutal but necessary. Victoria was finally acknowledging the depths of her betrayal, admitting that her treatment of Margaret hadn't been driven by practical considerations but by cowardice and selfishness. "And now?" Margaret asked. "What do you want now?" Victoria looked up at her mother with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time in months. "I want to take it back. All of it. I want to undo the hurt I've caused and go back to being the daughter you deserved." Margaret felt her heart crack open at the pain in Victoria's voice, the genuine remorse that was finally surfacing beneath years of sophisticated pretense. This was the daughter she remembered, the one who had possessed a conscience and the capacity for genuine love. "You can't undo the hurt, Victoria," Margaret said gently. "But you can choose differently from now on." "How?" Victoria asked desperately. "How do I fix something this broken?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, drawing on reserves of wisdom accumulated through decades of hardship and the recent clarity that had come from facing the worst and discovering she could survive it. You start by telling the truth, Margaret said finally. To Richard, to his family, to your friends. You stop protecting an image that requires you to deny the people who love you. You acknowledge that your success was built on someone else's foundation, and you honor that foundation instead of hiding from it. Victoria nodded slowly, understanding that the path back to integrity would require dismantling the carefully constructed lies that had become the basis of her new identity. And if they reject me when they know the truth? Victoria asked, voicing the fear that had driven her betrayal of Margaret. Then they weren't worth having in the first place, Margaret replied with the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had learned the difference between conditional and unconditional love. Real relationships survive truth, Victoria. The ones that don't survive weren't real to begin with. Victoria sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what her mother was asking her to do. Dismantling her false identity would require admitting to Richard and his family that she had been lying about her background. It would mean acknowledging Margaret publicly as the foundation of her success. It would risk everything she thought she had built her new life upon. But as she sat in that hospital room, looking at the woman who had loved her unconditionally for 30 years and who was offering forgiveness despite unforgivable cruelty, Victoria began to understand what she had really lost in her pursuit of social acceptance. I'm scared, Victoria admitted, her voice small and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been since childhood. I know, Margaret said, reaching out to take her daughter's hand for the first time in months. But being scared of losing fake relationships isn't a good reason to destroy real ones. Victoria squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the arthritis-swollen knuckles and work-roughened skin that told the story of decades of labor and sacrifice. These hands had worked countless jobs to pay for Victoria's opportunities. They had stayed up all night sewing costumes for school plays and cooking birthday cakes from scratch. They had signed loan papers and wiped away tears and applauded at graduations and celebrations. These hands deserved honor, not hiding. The woman who owned them deserved pride, not shame. Will you help me? Victoria asked, her voice breaking with the weight of finally asking for something more meaningful than her mother's invisible support. Help you do what? Margaret asked, though her heart was already opening to possibilities she had thought were lost forever. Help me figure out how to make this right. How to be the daughter you deserved all along. How to honor what you've done for me instead of hiding from it. Margaret felt tears flowing down her own cheeks now, but these were tears of relief and cautious hope rather than heartbreak and despair. The daughter she had raised, the one with conscience and capacity for growth, was still there beneath the sophisticated exterior. Yes, Margaret said simply. I'll help you. Over the next 2 hours, mother and daughter talked with an honesty and intimacy they hadn't shared in years. Victoria told Margaret about the pressure she felt in Richard's world, the constant anxiety about saying or doing something that would reveal her humble origins. Margaret shared the pain of watching her daughter transform from grateful child to a shamed adult, the loneliness of being excluded from the life she had made possible. They cried together, really cried, for the first time since Victoria had been a small child with scraped knees and hurt feelings. They mourned the years of connection they had lost to pride and fear and social ambition. They began to imagine what their relationship might look like if it were built on truth rather than pretense. When Daniel arrived for his daily visit, he found them holding hands and talking quietly, the hostile tension that had characterized their relationship replaced by something that looked like the beginning of healing. Mrs. Martinez, Daniel said with a smile that lit up his entire face. You look better than I've seen you in months. I feel better, Margaret replied, squeezing Victoria's hand. Victoria and I have been talking. Really talking. Daniel nodded approvingly, though he remained cautious. He had seen too much of Victoria's cruelty to immediately trust this apparent transformation. That's good. Communication is important in families. Victoria looked at Daniel with new eyes, seeing him not as an inconvenient witness to her mother's modest circumstances, but as someone who had provided the love and support that she herself had withheld. Daniel, Victoria said, her voice carrying a humility that had been absent for years. I owe you an apology. And a debt of gratitude. You've been the family to my mother that I should have been. Daniel studied Victoria carefully, looking for signs that this was another performance rather than genuine remorse. What he saw was a woman who appeared to be wrestling with the magnitude of her own failures, someone who was finally understanding what she had thrown away in her pursuit of social status. "Your mother is easy to love," Daniel said simply. "She's kind, generous, grateful for friendship, and interested in other people's lives. I don't understand why anyone would want to hide that kind of goodness." The comment was pointed but not cruel, a reminder to Victoria that Margaret's supposed shortcomings existed primarily in Victoria's imagination and social insecurity rather than in reality. "You're right," Victoria said, surprising Daniel with her directness. "There's nothing about my mother that I should have been ashamed of except my own reaction to her circumstances." Over the following days, as Margaret recovered her strength and prepared to leave the hospital, Victoria began the difficult process of dismantling the lies that had become the foundation of her relationship with Richard and his family. She started by telling Richard the truth about her background, about Margaret's sacrifices, about the engagement party exclusion that had contributed to her mother's medical crisis. She expected anger, disappointment, possibly the end of their engagement. Instead, Richard listened with growing understanding and, ultimately, admiration for Margaret's story and disappointment in Victoria's handling of it. "I wish I could have met her sooner," Richard said after Victoria finished her confession. "She sounds like exactly the kind of person my family respects, someone who knows what real sacrifice looks like and what genuine love requires." Eleanor Ashworth's reaction was even more powerful. When Victoria brought Margaret to Sunday dinner at the family estate, the first time Margaret had been included in Victoria's new world, Eleanor embraced her warmly and spent the entire evening drawing out stories about Victoria's childhood and Margaret's journey as a single mother. "You raised a remarkable woman," Eleanor told Margaret as the evening ended. "I can see where Victoria gets her strength and determination, even if she temporarily forgot how to honor their source." The integration wasn't always smooth. Margaret sometimes felt overwhelmed by the luxury and sophistication of Victoria's new world, and Victoria had to learn to navigate the gap between her two realities without abandoning either one. But gradually they found their balance. Victoria began bringing Margaret to social functions, introducing her with pride as the woman who had made her success possible. She used her position and resources to improve Margaret's medical care and living situation, not as charity but as the belated recognition of a debt long overdue. Margaret, in turn, learned to accept help graciously and to see Victoria's world not as a threat to their relationship, but as an expansion of possibilities for both of them. The wedding, when it took place 6 months later, was everything the engagement party should have been. A celebration that honored both where Victoria had come from and where she was going. Margaret sat in the front row, wearing a dress Victoria had chosen for her, watching with tears of joy as her daughter married a man who had learned to love not just Victoria but the story that had shaped her. In her wedding speech, Victoria publicly acknowledged Margaret's sacrifices for the first time, describing the 3 jobs, the sleepless nights, the financial struggles that had made her education and opportunities possible. "My mother taught me that love isn't just a feeling," Victoria said, looking directly at Margaret through her tears. "It's a choice you make every day, often when making that choice is difficult and costly. She made that choice for me for 30 years and I forgot to be grateful. I forgot to honor the foundation she built for my success. But I remember now, and I promise to spend the rest of my life showing her the appreciation she has always deserved." The audience, Richard's family, Victoria's colleagues, the society figures who had once seemed so intimidating to Margaret, rose in applause, not politely but with genuine emotion for a story of love and sacrifice that transcended social boundaries. Daniel was there too, having been invited not as the building's maintenance supervisor but as family, as someone who had proven that love creates bonds stronger than blood when blood fails to create love. As Margaret watched her daughter dance with her new husband, surrounded by people who now knew and respected her story rather than being hidden from it, she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. The journey from betrayal to reconciliation hadn't been easy or quick. It had required Victoria to risk everything she thought mattered in order to reclaim what actually did matter. It had required Margaret to forgive injuries that had seemed unforgivable, and to believe in the possibility of change when change seemed impossible. But they had found their way back to each other, And in doing so, they had discovered that love, real love, doesn't disappear when it's tested. It grows stronger, deeper, more precious for having survived the worst that fear and pride can inflict upon it. 3 years later, when Victoria gave birth to her first child, Margaret was the first person she called, the first person to hold her grandson, the first person Victoria thanked for making this moment possible. "I want him to know his grandmother's story," Victoria told Margaret as they sat together in the hospital room, the baby sleeping peacefully between them. "I want him to understand that sometimes the greatest strength looks like weakness to people who don't know how to see clearly. I want him to learn what real love looks like by watching how you loved me, even when I didn't deserve it." Margaret looked at her grandson, James Victoria Martinez Ashworth, named for the grandfather he would never meet but whose story would be part of his legacy, and felt the circle complete itself. The little boy would grow up in privilege, but he would also grow up knowing the story of the woman who cleaned offices and served coffee and worked until her body broke down to create the opportunities that made his comfortable life possible. He would learn to honor sacrifice rather than hide from it, to respect struggle rather than be ashamed of it, to understand that true wealth is measured in love given and received rather than in bank accounts or social status. Victoria had finally learned the lesson Margaret had been trying to teach her all along. That success without gratitude is empty, that achievement without acknowledgement of its sources is hollow, and that no amount of material wealth can replace the richness that comes from honoring the people who love you unconditionally. As Margaret held her grandson and watched Victoria document the moment with her phone, no doubt to share with the friends who now knew and respected Margaret's story, she whispered a prayer of gratitude for the second chance they had been given, for the wisdom that had come through suffering, for the love that had proven stronger than pride. The daughter who had once called her an old disable was gone, replaced by someone who introduced Margaret as the strongest woman I know, and meant every word. The relationship that had been shattered by shame had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. Margaret's story wasn't ending with abandonment and loneliness, as she had once feared. Instead, it was continuing with the kind of love she had always dreamed of. Love that survived testing, love that grew stronger through struggle, love that honored the past while embracing the future. This story reveals one of life's most painful truths, that success without gratitude is meaningless, and that shame about our origins ultimately impoverishes our souls more than poverty ever could. Margaret's journey teaches us. A mother's love and sacrifice create foundations that last forever, even when they're temporarily forgotten. Financial poverty never diminishes the wealth of genuine love and family bonds. True strength often looks like weakness to people who don't understand what real sacrifice means. Forgiveness doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. It means choosing freedom from bitterness while maintaining boundaries. Victoria's transformation shows us. Success achieved by denying our roots is built on sand and will eventually collapse. The people who shape us deserve honor, not hiding, regardless of their social status. Real relationships survive truth. Fake relationships require lies to exist. Pride comes before the fall, but humility can rebuild what pride destroys. Never abandon, reject, or feel ashamed of your parents because of their circumstances. Your parents' blessings, prayers, and sacrifices are the foundation of everything good in your life. Honor them while they live, respect their struggles, and remember that the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's the love that shaped you into who you are. Remember that behind every success story is someone who made sacrifices. Behind every achievement are hands that worked, hearts that worried, and love that never gave up. Don't let success make you forget your foundation. Don't let wealth make you ashamed of your roots. Don't let social climbing cost you the relationships that matter most. Busts in Silhouette. Subscribe for more powerful life stories that remind us what truly matters. Busts in Silhouette. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that touch your heart and change your perspective. Share this story with someone who needs to remember the power of family love and gratitude. Heart with Ribbon. Which part of this story touched your heart most? Share in the comments below. Your story might inspire our next video. Heart with Ribbon. Remember, the people who love you unconditionally are your greatest treasure. Don't trade them for anything, ever.